Everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Haelle, and I am the Health Beat Leader on Infectious Disease for AHCJ. This webinar is one in a series of topic-specific training opportunities to brief health journalists on the latest information in a particular health area and to give you story ideas or resources you can use in your work. Today's topic is long COVID. This is a sadly undercovered topic that is often either not only is it not well covered, but it is also the coverage of it is not great, and it doesn't cover everybody who needs to be covered. So joining us today will be two speakers. Leisa Navarro is a journalist and has long COVID herself, and Dr. Monica Verduzco Gutierrez is a physician at the University of Texas Health Science Center who specializes in physical rehabilitation and long COVID, and I believe has long COVID. And we will be using our first names during the continuation of this webinar. Please be sure that during the course of the webinar, as questions come up, you put your questions in the Q&A box. You will find that Q&A at the bottom of your screen, separate from the chat. We will not be watching the chat for questions. So if you have questions for us to ask during the Q&A period, they do need to go into the Q&A section. But now we will get started, and we're going to start with Dr. Monica Verduzco Gutierrez, pardon me.
Hello, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm just glad to get this group of engaged journalists that want to learn about this very important topic about long COVID and what to address. And so I'm going to mostly talk. I don't have slides. I won't bore you with that. We'll just kind of engage a little bit about. I'm going to start with, what is long COVID and what is this kind of, I don't know, COVID's dirty little secret maybe. And that is, now that everyone's tired of COVID. When I say COVID is not tired of us, it keeps on changing. It keeps on reinventing itself so that it can infect people again and continue to spread. One thing right now that I think that's important is that COVID is still around. We're actually, if you look at wastewater levels, which is a really great way to measure COVID levels, because we know testing isn't as robust. People aren't going to centers to test. They're testing at home, if they're even testing. But waste, you're going to poop and it's going to be in the wastewater. And those levels tell us that this is the second highest surge of the pandemic since the start of since 2020. This is the second highest. So I think something the numbers on 1 out of 3 people are probably going to get it in this surge with the numbers that we have. And it isn't, and we're probably kind of peaking, but it doesn't mean that when the peak's over, it goes down. It'll probably be through March that we're still kind of in this surge. So why does it concern us? And there are good things like, okay, we know that we have medications, some medications for acute COVID. We know how to treat patients a little bit better for acute COVID. Patients got vaccines, so that means that their disease isn't as severe. There's still really high hospitalizations for COVID, and then people are still getting mild disease. And a lot of people are getting mild disease. And then one thing that's happening to patients, anywhere from maybe like, I would say approximately 10%, if you're looking at the numbers, are going to get something called long COVID. And so long COVID is, a condition, signs, symptoms, or I actually like to say, okay, it can be 3 different things. So you've had a COVID infection, and then either you have your symptoms that continue and they're prolonged after for more than 4 weeks. Looking at some definitions, it's 4 weeks. At some definitions, it's 12 weeks. And that might be a continuation of some things like fatigue, just, brain fog, heart rate abnormalities, maybe some of the upper respiratory infection symptoms. There's also patients can get new symptoms that start after a COVID infection. So that's a lot of times, some patients, they may get COVID, their COVID might get a little bit better. That's what happened to me. I had really mild COVID, just kind of like allergies. And then a few weeks later, went on a run, and afterwards came back, like crashed, came back with had a whole body rash and hives in certain places, started getting migraines, started getting abnormal heart rates. And dizziness and other such symptoms. So then they can develop conditions afterwards. They may have post-exertional malaise, which is, significant exhaustion afterwards, pains, numbness, a lot of really bad fatigue, cardiac abnormalities, things like POTS is or autonomic dysfunction or dysautonomia. That's something that's probably one thing that I would say to that a lot of patients get dysautonomia or POTS and they don't know what it is. And that's something maybe that's a really good thing for journalists to cover, because patients are having these symptoms and they're worried about it. And, if this was something that they could learn about on the media, and it's something that even a lot of physicians don't know about or don't learn about themselves. And so it's nice for a patient to maybe be able to learn about it on media, because then they can go empowered with a little bit more information. And it's something, the heart rate that will elevate with activity or elevate when someone's up, but it's not just heart rate elevation. They can have dizziness, anything where it's like you're not getting good blood flow to your brain. They can have a ringing in their ears. They can have certain headaches, certain pains in their back of their neck, GI symptoms, anything that your body does automatically, that whole system can be messed up. And some patients will develop MECFS, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. And so for some of those patients, it can be quite debilitating. Like they can end up being bedbound or not be able to work. It's one of those kind of invisible disabilities, because they might look normal on the outside, and but they're not. And any little activity can really make someone crash. And then the other thing that can happen in long COVID is either worsening of conditions that you already had, or developing some kind of new condition that maybe you were on the fence with. So someone might have been pre-diabetic and they get COVID and then they develop full-blown diabetes. And this is something that even there's a new like ADA guidelines that came out this month. And one of the whole sections was on COVID and the effects of COVID on patients who are pre-diabetic or who are diabetic, and how it is causing both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I think that's something that a lot of people don't know. And diabetes early on and is another thing, could be a silent disease, and people may not know that they have diabetes until really it's too late, or they have some very bad effects from it. So these are kind of things that journalists may talk about. The other thing is it's causing a lot of patients to develop cardiovascular issues like high blood pressure. So, developing these new diseases that they didn't have before, something that my autonomic kind of POTS eventually became something where I have to now, my doctor's like, yeah, now it looks like you have high blood pressure too. And so that's something that I have to take medications for. And I'm otherwise was a marathon runner. So it isn't like I was this high risk person. I'm someone that was otherwise really healthy. And that's the other thing, that it does impact both, yes, patients who had disabilities before, but also people who were living their life and otherwise, healthy and were able to do lots of things. And again, most people have mild disease with COVID, but if it's still impacting 10% of people, that's still 10% of almost, everyone who's had COVID at this point. So those are kind of some of the main things. I mean, there's so many things that COVID can do. If you look at studies, they describe 50, 100, 200 symptoms related to COVID, conditions that develop afterwards. The other thing is, if people already had an underlying disease, someone may have had an autoimmune disease, those can get a lot worse. Like if they've had, lupus, their lupus can worsen, their arthritis can worsen, just because there's inflammation throughout the body. So really, I think, the importance is that COVID is here. It's still around. About 10% of people will get long COVID in some manifestation. And some people can do very well, meaning they're able to maybe balance some of their symptoms and can work. I'm able to work. I just have to, pick and choose the things that I do outside of work. We have to know who's at risk and, talk about risk factors, and kind of what I say, everyone's at risk. and what prevents or what decreases the risk of long COVID. Not getting COVID, so don't get COVID. Reinfections we're seeing as a problem too, so don't just continue to get COVID and get infected with COVID over and over again. That's a good message. Vaccines definitely decrease the risk of getting long COVID. So it doesn't take away the risk. Your risk isn't going to be zero, but the vaccines do decrease risk of getting long COVID. And then the other thing is like, who is not hearing about this? And I will tell you, sometimes even physicians aren't hearing about this and don't know all the details of what's long COVID, how should I be addressing it? So, there's still a lot of audiences that need to hear this information. And probably some good things to talk about is it's not, long COVID's not in the news, even COVID's not really in the news, but people just have to be reminded of things. If you've been exposed to someone who then tells you like, oh, you were at dinner last night, and then the next day the person says, hey, oh, now my test is positive for COVID, that means that, you had a significant exposure and you should be wearing a mask when you're around people for the next few days, testing yourself over the next few days, especially the incubation period right now is about 3 days, but that could be a little bit less and a little bit more for each person. So just kind of reminding people of some of the basics of COVID. Don't show up to work if you're sick. I was on an airplane yesterday and everyone's coughing in the airplane, and not everyone had a mask, but it's kind of like a little scary when you think about the things that are going around. So what are some, again, good things for reporters to talk about? So I think it's just great that you're here. You want to talk about long COVID. What are some of the things? What are some of the current coverage of long COVID? There is probably, it's hit or miss of stuff. I think sometimes seeing when big articles come out in our scientific literature, making sure that the lay press understands, kind of getting that information out. One big, story that had come out last week was a study where they had looked at muscles of patients who had recovered completely from COVID and those with long COVID, and they kind of made them go through exercise testing, and they looked at their muscles afterwards and showed that the people with long COVID had a lot of muscle changes compared to ones who didn't, meaning their mitochondria was different. That's the powerhouse of their cells, the amount of vessels that, help their muscles just didn't uptake oxygen as well. So it's interesting, like heart is good, lung is good, but it's the way that the muscle uptakes, there's not good energy, there's not good blood flow. They had amyloid deposits, and amyloid deposits is kind of an abnormal protein that forms. Actually, when people get a lot of amyloid deposits in their brain, that causes other problems as well. And so these are kind of the things that affected patients who had long COVID. And then if they exercised where it was too much, where they got into that post-exertional malaise crash, some of their muscles actually had necrosis, meaning it actually was like more, it was worse, it was torn down. It's like in some patients with long COVID that doing too much, pushing themselves too much, or pushing themselves with too much exercise might actually be harmful for them and their muscles. And so it's just different things that, it's important for people to learn. So those are just kind of things that I think that journalists could cover. The other thing that's tough is, there isn't good FDA approved medications, but we can treat certain things. We can, if someone develops POTS, we have treatments for POTS. If someone develops or asthma or high blood pressure, we can at least try to control those things as much as possible. And so the idea that, it's not hopeless, there is a way that we can at least control symptoms, and then getting the message out that, we need research in this area. We need funding for clinical trials for patients, and just telling people stories. So that's my kind of 15 minutes that I have, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Sorry, I had to hit unmute there. Thank you very much, Monica. Leisha, I'll pass it over to you. And just a reminder to everybody, it's great to have the chat going, but put your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll be going through those once we switch over to the Q&A. Go ahead, Leisha.
Hi, so I'm going to turn my slideshow on, but I might, sorry, now I can't see Zoom at all. But so I'll tell you a little bit about me first. So Tara invited me because I have been living with long COVID for 3 years. And while Monica talked to you all about, sorry, I'm just going to go back to Zoom because it's just really hard to look at that blank screen for now. So while Monica talked to you really about a lot of the medical and science issues, I want to talk to you about the personal issues. I have had COVID twice. Both times it disabled me, the second time much more so. And what I wanted to start out with is kind of to talk about my experience and how that can inform your experience reporting on long COVID. So looks can be deceiving. For example, I might look like I'm not sick, but I am in bed. I spend most of my time sitting in bed because I have POTS, which is the type of dysautonomia like Monica mentioned. I also have chronic nerve pain in my legs, and I have to use a wheelchair. So because of my POTS, I'm not able to stand up for more than a minute, really. So that really impacts everything in my life. It really impacts my family. My partner has to do really essentially everything for me and for our child. So we live a life that's very similar to what most people lived in the spring of 2020. We both work from home, and we homeschool our child. But I'm only able to really work 10 to 15 hours a week. And that is quite a challenge because of my limited energy from the long COVID. So I explain all of this to say that, you know, when you see long COVID in a person, it might just look like it's this, what one person is grappling with, but it really has this huge ripple effect. And so I'll talk a little bit more later about ways to find stories about that, but that's just something I really want to impress upon people. My partner, for example, has been able to get an accommodation to work from home. We live in Canada. I'm from the US, but live in Canada. And he's been able to have an accommodation to work from home, but that's a constant battle to get, even though there is in our province in Canada, there is human rights law, which guarantees accommodation for caregivers of disabled family members or spouses. So all of this is to say that, this has really impacted my partner, really impacted my child, who, doesn't really live a normal life like kids used to, or many still do, but this is what we have to do to keep ourselves safe. So we avoid going inside anywhere. I have to limit the healthcare that I can get because it's just so dangerous for me to go inside anywhere. The second time that I got infected with COVID was in a medical appointment, and I was wearing an N95, and it was right in the midst of the surge of Omicron in January of 2022. For those of us who are really impacted by long COVID, we have had to change our lives a lot. And that's something that I think that is not well known. I think even in my own life, it's sometimes hard for people, for friends and family members, to really understand what life is like for me and for other people like me. So the next point, I'm not trying to directly contradict Monica, but I wanted to talk specifically about the fact that there is no treatment for long COVID and there is no cure for long COVID yet. And so for the past 4 years, 3 that I've had long COVID and 4 that some other people have had it, that has been really disheartening and just scary, that we're watching our bodies really suffer and potentially degrade, our brain health, our heart health, our cardiovascular health. So it is a little bit more hopeful now in that there are a lot more clinical trials happening, but it is still on a day-to-day basis. It is scary. You know, I have this heart condition now, the central nervous / heart condition called dysautonomia, or POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And I take 2 medications a day, and I still can't stand up to shower. I still can't cook. And that's, you know, even sitting on a stool, I can't cook because I can't raise my arm. So I don't want to go into all of this too much because I want to get to how to report better on long COVID. But the last point I wanted to say from a really personal point is that for those of us who are, you know, moderately, severely, even some people who are mildly affected by long COVID, it is really a journey of grief, you know, for people like me who have been disabled by long COVID. It is a really difficult process to process that grief, and for those of us that can, to get through to the other side, which I have. But in addition to that grief and that, you know, darkness, there is also something to be said for us gaining a community in the disabled community, being able to accept ourselves. For example, I had some disabilities before long COVID that I didn't recognize as disabilities. So now that I am disabled by long COVID, I'm able to advocate for myself. I'm able to, you know, ask for accommodations, demand accessibility. And so I just like for you, when you're reporting on long haulers, to not just see it as that darkness and that grief, but also as, you know, disability is a very human condition. And, you know, before the pandemic, you know, at least 25% of the American population was disabled. Plus, I think another third of the population had a chronic illness. So some of that could even be considered disability. So it's not always doom and gloom. And something that I like to say, long COVID is called a mass disabling event, but I also have found myself and with a lot of the other long haulers who I've met that it is really a mass radicalizing event. So it has made us, you know, demand our rights, fight for the rights of disabled people beyond just our own personal experiences. And that's something really powerful. And that's something that's not going to go away. You know, if there is at some point eventually thorough, totally, you know, effective treatments and cures. Say I was to not be disabled, not be physically disabled by long COVID anymore, I would still be a disability advocate. I would still be an advocate for vulnerable people, for marginalized people. And so that's something that is, that will continue to be really powerful about long COVID. Excuse me, I have year-long allergies. So something that is just really missing in long COVID coverage is diverse representations of long haulers. So first of all, and I noticed this in the Q&A, people of color are the most impacted by long COVID. So that was, somebody was asking, you know, who's most likely to get long COVID. From my reporting, I don't believe that this is a question of genetics, but it is a question of structural racism. So Latinas are the most, statistically, the most impacted by long COVID, with African Americans not long behind. And even those statistics are likely a pretty vast undercount because of the lack of information in the public sphere about what long COVID is. And the something that Monica has spoken to me when I've interviewed her, the lack of training among family physicians and physicians in general about how to diagnose long COVID. So right there, you know, Black and brown people are the most impacted by long COVID. You would not know that from media. As well, 80%, up to 80% of long haulers are women, which is the same with MECFS, that women are really, really, really disproportionately affected. And that is also often not represented in the media. You know, I see a lot of media coverage with white men as the main long haulers interviewed. And it's just really problematic. It's not the truth of what's happening. You know, long COVID is very much intersectional. It impacts people in different ways, depending on their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, health/disability level before getting long COVID. And so that needs to be a part of any reporter's coverage of long COVID. And so part of that is that I see a lot of the time, I see a lot of the same long haulers interviewed over and over again. And there's one long hauler who is, bless him, he is a wonderful advocate. He's a white guy in his 30s, and he has, you know, become really debilitated by long COVID and spends a lot of time speaking out about it. But by reporters, you know, essentially copying and pasting, not copying and pasting his words, but seeing, okay, this is somebody who's been interviewed a lot, when they Google, and then go and call him. Don't do that. Find other sources. I just have to take a sip of water. Something else to really think about is avoiding the narrative of people being 100% healthy until stricken and / disabled with long COVID. That is the case for a lot of long haulers, but it's also not the case for a lot of long haulers. And so I think sometimes that showcasing that of people who were healthy, didn't have any health issues, you know, no pre-existing conditions, can kind of diminish the importance of the fact that we do have a lot of vulnerable people in society who are struggling with long COVID, and that nobody is more deserving of health than anybody else. And like Monica said, you know, everybody is at risk now. And I excuse my long COVID brain, but I can't remember if she said this specifically, but essentially everybody who's had COVID now has the pre-existing condition, the risk factor of having had COVID. So the next time you get COVID, that puts you more at risk of getting long COVID, as well as the fact that you might not get long COVID right away. You know, I didn't get long COVID when I first became ill. It happened about 8 months after I had an asymptomatic case. So I think the stories that are about people who've been healthy and then become really disabled and really ill with long COVID as being kind of the only story that's shown, gives people a false sense of invincibility. Okay, so more for finding diverse representations. I know I'm taking up a little bit of extra time, so Tara, I'm just gonna try to go through as quickly as I can.
Don't worry.
Okay, thanks. So long COVID online communities will be really generous in putting you in touch with sources, especially on Facebook, because those are the most kind of closed communities, so people can be really vocal and be really, you know, talk about very personal issues. The ones that I'm in, you know, almost daily, the admins of the groups put out calls for, oh, such and such a media is looking for such and such a specific, you know, description of a long hauler. So don't be afraid to do that. You know, don't join long COVID communities and troll, but find the, you know, when you look at a Facebook group, it's very easy to find who the admin is, and just send them a DM and say, this is what I'm looking for. And some of the long haulers who I've interviewed as well, who are, you know, from the groups that are most impacted but are most marginalized, so Latinas and Black folks. You can also just find them by you know, I had a really hard time finding Latina long haulers through Facebook, so I ended up kind of searching through Twitter and found people who said in their bios that they were Latina and spoke about having long COVID, and that was harder to do, but it netted some really amazing stories that otherwise wouldn't have been told. So in addition to thinking about diverse representations of long haulers, think about diverse representations of professionals working with long haulers. So I just did a story which Tara either has shared or will share for Palabra, which is the online outfit the online outlet for NAHJ, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, about Latinos being the most impacted by long COVID and being just, you know, kind of en masse ignored, undertreated, undercounted. And I unintentionally, but also intentionally, I think all of the experts who I interviewed were people who are Latine. And so that, you know, it really added so many dimensions to the story, because especially in the case of that story specifically, which was looking at cultural competency in care, looking at cultural stigmas around chronic illness and disability, white professionals who are, you know, are not bilingual, who are not bicultural, will not have the same insights. You will miss out on a lot of detail in your reporting. Okay, this is really important. This is something that that I have learned a lot about. Long haulers have talked to me about. You need to adapt how you work to work with long haulers. First of all, inform yourself about long COVID extensively before you do any interviews, because there is a lot out there. You know, spend hours if you're doing an enterprise story or an investigative story or just any story, really. Spend some time reading what's already been done about long COVID, about the science of long COVID, about sorry, I just had a child walk into the room, so it got distracted a little bit. You don't want to make your sources use what is really rare energy to explain the basics to you. Like, as an aside, for example, this is my only activity today. You know, after this hour, I'm going to be exhausted. And it's the same for your sources. But don't make assumptions that every long hauler will have had the same experience. So, you know, when you've read up, when you've talked to some long haulers, don't assume that every other long COVID experience is going to be the same. Everybody has unique factors in their lives. So be open to that diversity of experiences. Really, really, really important. Use trauma-informed reporting techniques. If this isn't something that you know about, learn about it. For a lot of long haulers, especially those who have moderate to severe long COVID, this is one of, if not the most traumatic experiences of their lives, because, you know, becoming really ill, especially for those who have a really hard time getting answers from their doctors, which is a lot of long haulers, me included. It's scary. You don't know what's happening to you. You don't know if you're going to die. You don't know if you're going to get better. And it can be really triggering for people to go through their stories again. So, you know, learning about trauma-informed reporting techniques will prepare you to speak with sources and tease out their stories in ways that are not harmful to them. And so some of the other things I'm going to talk about are trauma-informed, but I think they're really specific to working with long haulers. Don't pressure sources with deadlines. You know, we're all juggling our health on a day-to-day basis. Those of us who are able to work are juggling, often pushing ourselves to work when we really probably shouldn't. Those of us with kids are juggling parenting. So know that long haulers are being generous when they talk to you. They're probably doing it out of, honestly, care for others. That's what I found with every long hauler I talk to. They talk about wanting to inform others, you know, like letting their words be kind of a PSA to others about long COVID. So acknowledge that people are being generous, acknowledge that people are using very rare, very precious energy, and don't push them. And with that, you know, if you need to cast a wider net, you know, don't just, hone in on one source. If they're not getting back to you, cast the net out for 3 or 4 sources. If 3 or 4 people say, okay, it's always better to say, okay, I found somebody else who I could talk to. I won't need you, but thank you for being willing to talk to me, than pressuring somebody. Something that a long hauler colleague mentioned to me when I was getting ready for this, that she has found to be really important. Don't assume that people have access to technology, to unlimited internet, to office, supplies, computers, things like that. Especially given that statistically long COVID is shown to be more common in people of lower incomes. This is a demographic that really needs to be reported on, and you need to do it in a way that that is accessible to people, not just in terms of disability or health accessibility, but also social accessibility. And I'll get to a little bit more about that in a second. Be really, really, really transparent. This is, again, a trauma-informed technique, but remember that the people who you're going to talk to, they've probably never talked to a reporter before. They don't know anything about the interview process. They may be really nervous. They may feel very vulnerable. They may feel scared. Explain what things like on the record means. Explain that everything they tell you, unless they specify otherwise, will be potentially in your story, and that if there are things that they don't want to be in the story, that you need to know that. Be prepared for longer interviews than you expected. When I was doing a lot of reporting in the fall on women of color with long COVID, I kept telling people that I needed like 30 to 45 minutes of their time. Often these interviews ended up being an hour and 30 minutes to 2 hours. Sometimes I even had to be the one to cut off the interview because it was just so exhausting for me to talk for that long. But people really need to be heard. And a lot of times, especially those of us who are just, like pushing through our lives, and those of us with kids who can't really air our emotions about our illness. This may be one of the rare times that people get to talk about what they've been through. A lot of our families and friends don't understand, and often don't have the curiosity to understand. And so people need to be heard. Let them be heard. Okay, this is linked to the question of technology, but accessibility and accommodations. Long COVID, as I said before, is extremely energy limiting. So you need to, at the get-go, with any long hauler, offer these different options for how to do interviews. I always say this in a list, do it in bullet points so it's easy for people to read. I just didn't have space for bullet points here. Say we can do it by text message or WhatsApp. We could do it by voice memos. You send questions to the source, they respond one by one with voice memos, which can be over the course of a day, a week, a month, by phone, by video call, either with video on or off. People may prefer to use Zoom rather than phone, but they don't want to actually do it on video. In chunks over one or more days, or by email. And all of these options are completely valid. I know a lot of us, either editors or J School has taught us that, you have to do an interview either by phone or in person. Anything else is inadequate. That's just not true. And I would actually really encourage people to think about offering these accommodations to sources other than long haulers, because there's lots of other disabled people and people with other, needs that require accommodations that you may not know about. And so anyway, that's my little soapbox. This is so, 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 so important. If you meet with a long hauler in person, I would say really, if you interview anybody in person, but especially long haulers, wear a minimum of an N95 mask. When I say minimum, there are also what's called elastomeric masks, which are N95 and above level of protection, but they're reusable. So, they're better for the environment. They can be also more effective in that some of them block out closer to 100% of particles. And I urge everybody to do this regardless of whether a source asks you to do this. Sometimes sources may not have the health literacy to know that this is something that they should be asking for. They may feel nervous about asking it. They may feel like there's kind of an authority figure of you as a journalist, and they don't want to put you out. But just know that if you don't wear a mask, you risk dramatically worsening your source's health and disability, and you don't want that on your conscience. Okay, so hang on just one second. Yeah, great. So this is pretty much my last one. But for finding long COVID stories, I've talked before about earlier about different ways to do that, but my partner wanted me to urge everybody to understand that long COVID is real. So I think the fact that you're in this webinar means that you do understand that. But make sure that your editors understand that. There was a piece in the Scientific American in the end of the year that the writer who's an academic, she didn't put this as the headline. The editors put it, it was, I asked Dr. Fauci if long COVID was real. And they just got ripped apart by long haulers on Twitter with reason. So make sure that your editors and your higher ups know that long COVID is real, and long COVID stories are everywhere. The economy is being impacted by long COVID. You look at, work shortages, labor shortages. A lot of that is long COVID, even though it's not attributed to that. In most media, but if you dive into the statistics, you will find it. There's great work by Katie, I forgot her last name, at Brookings, who is repeatedly doing research on how long COVID is impacting the economy, the amount of billions per year that is in lost wages, industry delays, postal delays can sometimes be related to people being off work. I saw today in the CBC here in Canada that there's a lack of substitute teachers. Surprise, everybody's sick with COVID right now. The healthcare system is in disarray. It's going to get to be in worse disarray, honestly, because, healthcare workers are exposed to COVID. A lot of them have had it. People have long COVID now or will develop it in the future.
I'm
really,
sorry,
really, yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, Leisha, but we
okay,
really
maybe, yeah, I will share this afterwards. So this is my last slide, but just, everybody take a little look at it. Let me just say two things.
I don't think we can't see the slides that you have.
You haven't seen my slides this whole time?
No, I thought that because when you took it down from sharing the screen, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I was.
No, it's okay. What we'll do though, I can include the slides in the post that I'm writing, the wrap up.
I'm so sorry about that.
No,
I thought everybody could see them. Yeah, definitely. I had intended to include them the whole time. My apologies about that.
No, I didn't realize that when you switched it off, that switches it off for us as well.
Sorry about that. I forgot to put it back on again.
But okay, I can include those in the
wrap up. Yes. Great. And feel free, anybody, to ask me, to contact me later on and ask me questions. So yeah.
You've provided some really fantastic information. I felt bad having to cut you off. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to go in order of the questions, and I don't know if we'll get to all of them. So I'm hoping we can move through as many as we can. One question that came in early on from Bethany Brookshire: what do we know about the underlying biology that might cause these new symptoms after a COVID infection? And that's probably more of a question for Monica.
Right. So I think we have actually a lot of data now on underlying biology. And so I think it's things that could be reported on and that we know, now that definitely there are disturbed immune responses. And so some patients with long COVID, they're either finding, it seems like their body is continuously fighting an infection. And so they have these like exhausted T cells, and, some even have their blood work almost looks like someone who has HIV. So they're really, getting other infections and those kinds of things. So we know it's part immunologic that might be driven by viral persistence, like parts of the virus that are still in the body. There's mitochondrial dysfunction, there's inflammation, there's, microclotting and vascular dysfunction and vasculitis. There's dysbiosis, which means like our gut flora changes, and that kind of leads to abnormal responses and abnormal signaling. So if we have a lot of neurons in our gut, and if that's, not signaling the right way to the other parts of our bodies, that messes everything up. So it's kind of like there's a lot of things that are going on. We have more and more data that's proving that. So we just don't have maybe a good blood test yet, for long haulers to get, but we know. And then some patients, we don't know which response that they're having. Like, is their immune response over responding or under responding? And so that's where we still need more research and data.
Excuse me. Another question about one person asked about who's more likely, and that was already answered. And the vaccines have a role that we see it, especially under underrepresented groups and marginalized individuals and people who've already had COVID. What is the latest thinking on whether Paxlovid or metformin can help prevent long COVID?
So I think some of the thought is, there's one study that came out and said like Paxlovid helped and decreased the risk of long COVID because hopefully you're decreasing viral burden in the body. And then a recent study that came out just really again last week from UCSF showed that actually, you know, it didn't. So, and in that study, about 14% of people were still experiencing long COVID type symptoms. So, you know, we can't just rely on that. Then we also know, you know, as another story that Paxlovid is being probably underprescribed, and, you know, patients aren't getting access to it when they should be getting access to it. So hopefully I answered that. And then metformin had good data too, but that's something that, again, physicians don't even know all the data on that. On metformin, you know, they tried it for kind of an acute infection, really didn't do that much acutely, but when they, you know, continue to follow these patients out, that the patients who are on metformin were less likely to have long COVID when they got it, you know, at the initial infection.
And what about the people who get multiple rounds of Paxlovid, presumably to combat viral persistence? Is there any indication that that could help, or if they have a Paxlovid rebound and then they take the Paxlovid again, or?
I think that we still don't know, you know, it's just kind of here and there that people might get it again, you know, might get another course of it. And really the trials are being done right now for patients who have long COVID to see if, you know, taking Paxlovid or some other kind of special antivirals will help with long COVID symptoms. So we'll see.
And I do have questions for Leisa too, but Leisa, thank you so much for answering some of these questions in the Q&A. That's fantastic. But another question for Monica here. What kind of data do we have on long COVID among older adults, especially since they tend to have already more comorbidities to start with? Are they at higher risk? And how is the medical community addressing that?
So I think actually probably the best data we have on older adults is what's coming out of the VA. And again, that's mostly going to be men, but it is an older population, and kind of that data, mostly coming from Ziad Al-Ali, is showing that patients who get COVID, even if you didn't have a serious infection, you know, you're going to have impacts for even 2 years, whether that be more hospitalizations, more medical problems, more long COVID symptoms, more death. And so again, that was an older population, more men than women. So again, this population's at risk. The other thing is that, you know, there's still more to see, but there's concerns about patients having more cognitive issues, you know, developing more neurocognitive issues as they age. And so it's there. Again, these patients are at risk. It's another story that needs to be told.
And then this is a question for Leisa, but I'm going to follow it up with a question after that for Monica. Leisa, were you given was there an official sort of long COVID diagnosis that was put into your records? And then I don't know why I just had balloons in my face. I'm sorry. And then my follow-up question to that after you answer, Leisa, for Monica, is how are they coding for long COVID? Because obviously when COVID first came out, ICD wouldn't have been able to catch up with that. So I'm curious how this is getting captured in medical records, and whether that might be affecting like prevalence estimates or even incidence estimates. So, but first, Leisa, if you could tell us about your experience with that.
Yeah, so I have never had a positive COVID test, but I have been diagnosed with long COVID. I'm lucky because a lot of people don't necessarily have that that experience, but it hasn't helped me at all. It hasn't helped me to be diagnosed with it, to be honest. Maybe a tiny bit, but it's still very difficult to access care, difficult to access specialists, because there are no, other than a select amount of long COVID clinics around the world, there are not people who are specializing in long COVID. And I know Monica can answer this, but there are ICD codes for long COVID.
There is. It's U09.9. And so that actually didn't start until October 2021. So some of us had already been doing the work of long COVID for a year at that point before it became a code, you know, an ICD-10 code that we could use. The other thing is a lot of doctors may not know, or they not be using it. There's actually studies where they've looked and seen like what percentage of people are using this code, and it's like very few doctors that are actually using this code. And it's not because there's very little long COVID, it's just because either it's not being attributed to it, or the doctors don't know to use it.
Returning to the risk factors, are there age groups that are more vulnerable to long COVID? And are there certain strains that have been more highly associated with long COVID? And I'll add on to that. Does your severity, is there any correlation between severity of the COVID infection or lack thereof correlate to long COVID?
So, okay, so first on the severity, yes. If you have a more severe COVID, you're going to more likely have long COVID symptoms, but that might be someone that looks different than someone who had mild disease and wasn't hospitalized. And then we just have a vast, huge number of more people who had mild disease. And so the more long COVID we're going to see is going to be in people who had mild disease. It's still not good to be hospitalized because they will, have and be in the ICU because again, we knew any other infection beforehand or any other hospitalization can give you lingering effects. As far as which strains, probably the earlier strains were worse. I think we keep on seeing that in studies. So if you got it earlier in the pandemic, Omicron, had more issues. So again, more severe disease at the beginning and then more percentage of long COVID, but that doesn't mean that it's gone away at all. So it's still there. And then about what age groups are vulnerable, probably if you look at the data like from the CDC or from the household pulse survey, it's kind of actually in that data, it's a bell curve where it's like 40s, 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s kind of have the most long COVID and a little bit less in the younger and a little bit less in the older. But I think if we're not maybe looking at it in the right way, because these are, patients answering questions, but then I think, again, like someone had brought up, it can happen in the older population, maybe just looks a little bit different with worsening of diseases or development of new diseases or being hospitalized for more things.
Leisha, I'm going to ask you the question that Liz has in the Q&A in just a moment, but I'm going to skip ahead first to a question at the end here because someone else had messaged me about it. What do we know about the biological connections between MECFS and long COVID? And I'm curious if there's a differential in the diagnoses there, how much of it's overlap? Because you mentioned that people with long COVID may develop MECFS. What do we know about that relationship?
So I think one of the answers is, some people ask, is long COVID just MECFS? And I think the answer is no, but I think the answer is maybe some varying degree of it. So the MECFS community has been dealing with, having underreporting, underfunding, under research for decades and decades.
And lots of gaslighting.
And gaslighting and everything else, right? And terrible studies and all these other things. Yeah. And so I think they're learning that a lot of the biological connections are similar as they're starting to do some things like 2-day exercise testing, seeing that there's mitochondrial dysfunction, seeing that there's gut dysbiosis, that there's immunologic problems. So again, they're seeing a lot of overlap in what MECFS is and what long COVID is. And we know that MECFS can be infection associated as well. So it can be, triggered by an infection way before we had SARS-CoV-2. It could have been from the flu or from, something else. So I think we're seeing there's a lot of overlap. Hopefully we're going to have more studies, from Recover and other such things that are going to look and see like which patients who have long COVID also meet criteria for MECFS.
Leisha, the question was whether you could talk a bit more about how long COVID has impacted your work as a journalist, and if you're comfortable doing so, how it's impacted the family budget. And just for the record, this question comes from Liz Siegert, who's our Health Beat leader on aging. And she noted that Leisha was actually a JAWS Health Journalism Fellow in 2023. So there was some inside information there. And I would add on to that question, because I'm asking a sensitive question, are there questions that you wish journalists would not ask you? I noticed that you answered several questions in the Q&A saying that your symptoms have not improved and that there's not much. And I remember reading a article where someone talked about what they wish people would not ask them about long COVID. And one of the top things was, don't ask me if I'm getting better because I never am. And I wondered if that was something that the journalists should avoid, or if there is a way to get at that question without asking it in that way. So
let me just answer that part first, because I think that is more when people in your personal life ask you. There was a Twitter thread about it. I think yesterday or the day before that I chimed in on. It's more like if if your friend texts you and it's like, are you getting better? And you say no, or you just don't answer because it's really awkward, or it traumatizes you, or it depresses you. So in terms of things that I wish, I would personally never be interviewed by a journalist. I just know too much about how the sausage is made. So not questions not to ask. I'm not sure. I think people should use their good judgment on that. And tell sources, please feel free to say that you don't want to answer it to anything that I ask you. Okay, Liz, thank you for asking this. The JAWS Fellowship was wonderful. If there's any, emerging health reporters or people who are just trying to get into health reporting, apply next year. And oh God, long COVID has impacted my work as a journalist so much. I used to be a field reporter. I did a lot of coverage in Latin America. That was actually what I specialized in, covering Latin America before I had a kid and took a career break. I was on my career break when I got sick. So it's been just so different. I've had to adapt to figuring out how to really create rapport with sources through video and phone, how to report for fact and for scene, because I'm so used to being able to like paint a scene, and I do mostly long form work. And I can't leave home. I'm homebound. I'm lucky. I haven't left home for a month. I probably won't leave home for a while because in the cold it really messes up my nerve pain. And sorry, I just can't see the rest of the question now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can see it now. It's okay. So I keep a running list about journalists with long COVID, because I want to write something maybe for CJR or something about it, because it's there's a lot of us out there. There are a lot of us out there, and there's more people out there. Something that I didn't say earlier that I should have is that there are a lot of people with long COVID who, number one, don't realize it, or number two, will not admit it. People are afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of losing their homes. They're afraid of losing everything, their relationships. And a lot more people have long COVID that don't realize it or are not recognizing it, I think, than maybe people who are diagnosed. And in terms of budget, I'm terrified of my future. I've always been self-employed as a journalist. I have no pension. I have no, I haven't been paying into Social Security because I live in Canada. Essentially, I started working to help me with my mental health with long COVID, and now I can't stop working because we need the money, with interest rates having gone up. And I'm saving for my future care, to be totally honest, because my kid says, Mama, I wish you wouldn't work so much. And I say, well, I'm doing that so that you don't have to spend all your money taking care of me. This is actually making me feel really emotional because, I'm 45 and I feel often like I'm in my 80s, and my future terrifies me. And just to answer your question, Liz, and to mention it, like, my family does live in this very small space, which one of the pieces that I wrote recently that Tara included describes this. And so my family is cooped up at 640 square feet the majority of our time, because we live in this very expensive city in Toronto. And all we could afford to buy when we bought a place was a very small condo with no outdoor space. So what we do is, when we can, we do home swaps, and we go to houses in the country that have backyards, so my kid can be outside, because between my being homebound and my husband, working more than full time and doing everything in our household, my kid otherwise doesn't get outside a lot. And that's what I was saying earlier, that long COVID drastically impacts families.
That was a perfect stopping point. We didn't quite get to every single question, but we got almost all of them. And I'm going to include all the links that have been shared throughout this in the post that I will put up after all of this. Thank you both so much for this time that you've given us. I say that to all of the people who come on our webinars, but for you guys, I want to put exclamation points after it many times over, because it is a true sacrifice for you to be giving us this time. And, this is costing you much more than our usual guests who come on here. So thank you very, very much for sharing your time and your stories and your vulnerability. To everybody else, this webinar will be available for recording. We will have this posted on the AHCJ website once the recording is ready. Thank you all again. And if you tuned in late, we'll have it up. It'll be just a few hours before we have it up. We will continue to bring you webinars on a wide variety of health topics. I am tripping over my words. I'm so sorry. I'm so focused on all the stories you shared us. If you sign up for the AHCJ newsletters, you will hear about all of those webinars and be able to attend future webinars as well. And you can find our past webinars on our website. Thank you for joining us today, and good luck on your stories.